Well, one good reason that I didn't last is that somehow Madiba was convinced that it's not suitable for a king to be part of a parliamentary process, you know. And that time the premier was Omrey Dalindyebo. So he spoke to Omrey to try and talk me out of parliament. Well, I refused to Omrey, you know. I refused because I was saying to him, look, even if Madiba feels this way, but he's not about to provide an alternative life for me. I just need this part of life, you know, because I'm not a good scholar. So this is somehow exposure, you know, and some form of bush education for me. Then Omrey was quite sentimental to my reasoning. But I don't know what other reasons the old man had that compelled Omrey to beg me and understand his situation. Well, I had to come to an understanding with Omrey, and I said I will just tender a resignation letter. So that's what I did, and I left the legislature.
You came back home?
I returned home. I had to come back to the throne again. I stayed on the throne.
Had anything changed while your brother was sitting there?
It wasn't a long time. Nothing much changed, you know. Sometimes you would ask is it the brains that are in charge or the environment, which is a challenge that determines the progress and, you know, improvement. But you would see nothing has changed, and I think that's what made me feel like going back to Parliament after I had only stayed for 2 years, you know. You would find this scenario of chieftainship almost being sidelined or, in a way, downplayed by politicians. It almost felt like it's coming to an end, and it felt like people under the new dispensation are willing to eliminate traditional leadership. Well, because at the time ANC looked unchallengeable, unstoppable, and it took nearly everything into its own hands. So the kind of services that we were exposed to by government would not allow any leader or any traditional leader to make any visible changes in as far as kingship is concerned. I did not make that change. It doesn't matter how popular I may have been within African National Congress ranks. You know, when it comes to ANC, it is not my personal popularity. It is in fact my father's role that becomes more significant. And this is what we thrive on as a kingdom, because we could have been insignificant in the modern dispensation, but because we contributed in the struggle, not only my father, but also my great-grandfather. Unfortunately, my grandfather died a young man. my great-grandfather was also involved in the formation of the African National Congress. Even his son, who Madiba grew under at Mkhakezweni, that was Chief John Ndaba, is also a very good contributor in the circles of the African National Congress. But at some point, the African National Congress, was at war with traditional leaders. I think the friction began from around 1921 or 23, when they were improving the Second Land Act, the 1913 Land Act, because the ANC was established in 1912, and in 1913 there was this Land Act. And now in I think it was 1927, if I'm not mistaken, then the government of the day to come up with laws that they would be able to manage black communities, they needed to win the hearts and minds of chiefs or traditional leaders. And I think at that time they clinched an understanding and they won the hearts and minds of chiefs, and most of them disassociated them with the struggle or with the ANC. So that's when the ANC turned its back on traditional leaders and found them to be sellouts, found them to be backstabbers.
So this history goes back.
It goes back.
It goes back many years.
Yeah. But of course, these things, they were followed by the Black Administrations Act and other acts of separation, apartheid acts, of course, because apartheid is not from 1652, you would call that colonialism. But apartheid is new. It's something of the 20th century or the 21st century. So when the ANC one more time needed to mobilize in rural areas, it needed the support of traditional leaders. This is when they started interacting with people like my father. At the time, the most popular organization in our region here was Pan-Africanist Congress. Most people followed or were members of the Pan-Africanist Congress. And then the few people that were mobilized by the ANC then at the beginning was James Gatti. James Gatti, who was an elderly who became a member of parliament. James Gatti, my father, and people like Xobololo. Then those people started mobilizing for the African National Congress. And one of the things that encouraged them to mobilize for the African National Congress is because they were opposing Matanzima's encroachment. So Matanzima's encroachment to traditional leadership, that is his elevation from a headman to a chief, from a chief to a paramount chief, And all those things were done to him in search of entrenching the Black Administrations Act, and the apartheid government needed a black intellectual who would stand next to them to advocate and to, encourage other traditional leaders as well as the black community to accept these acts, to accept these rules and regulations. So my father belonged to the group that did not welcome these things, most probably because of, influence that also came from Madiba, because Madiba was also somehow in touch before he was president.
News that moves. eNCA.com.